Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Olsen, and I'm the Director of the New York State Office for Aging. I'm really excited about the program we're going to bring for you today and the dialogue that we're going to have. But before we do that, I want to first thank Kelly Matija, who's our Communications Director, who does all the behind-the-scenes work to make these productions as great as they are. You know, we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of months trying to bring a variety of information and programs to you under the theme not only of how we're doing our business better under this COVID pandemic, but really our mission is to connect the dots. We have so many amazing individuals that we work with both at the state level and at the community level, and trying to tighten those partnerships, make sure that people know what types of resources are out there to assist you in a variety of different topics and settings is really what this is all about. So today we're going to talk about a really, really important issue, and that issue is housing. And we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to have a dialogue about the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition and what it is that they do and how they can be a resource to many of you and your families, but also talk really importantly about the protections that are in law and in place, especially going through this time period where we have an eviction moratorium, both at the state level, but at the federal level, which is going to be expiring in the months to come without any additional federal action, and some of the things that you need to be aware of, but more importantly, who you can connect to should you have questions or need some assistance. So I'm really, really excited to invite two special guests on the program today. The first is Mark Streb, who is the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition. We'll talk a little bit about what that is, what resources they have, and how we can work better together, but a resource for you at your community level, because there's quite a few of them around the state. And then our very own Charlene Bradt, we will call her Charlie, who is an Assistant Director at the New York State Office for the Aging for Local Program Operations. But more importantly, she came from the housing advocacy community before joining us and has extensive experience about that. So Mark and Charlie, really happy that you're here today. As you know, New York State became the first age-friendly state under Governor Cuomo's leadership about 2 years ago. One of the primary elements, the 8 domains of age-friendly is housing for obvious reasons. Without safe, affordable, enabling housing, that really impacts our day-to-day lives, our health, and our safety. And this is a really, really difficult time for so many people who are, you know, struggling in terms of their work. They may have lost a job. They may be receiving less monthly benefits and unemployment insurance. And unfortunately, frankly, we are at least 6 months away from getting out of this pandemic if the recent news regarding the Pfizer vaccine in particular, but a couple of the other vaccines come to fruition to get to critical mass, as the governor was talking about yesterday. So Mark, why don't we start with you? For folks who, again, we don't know what we don't know, right? We're bombarded with information all the time. And unless you really need something, you know, we don't pay attention to things we don't need until we're, unfortunately, a lot of times in a crisis. So folks may not know what a neighborhood preservation coalition is. That's you, but equally as important, your members and what those companies really are out there to do.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this Facebook Live. And I appreciate the partnership that the Office of Aging has with the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition and neighborhood preservation companies. So let me start by going back to the beginning, a little quick, brief, hopefully brief history lesson of the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition. So the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition is a coalition of neighborhood preservation companies. And what are neighborhood preservation companies? I had to go back a little bit farther, even before that. The Neighborhood Preservation Program was started in 1977 by the late, great Assemblyman Denny Farrell. He recognized that there was a need for not-for-profits in the community, local groups, you know, community groups that were doing great work. And a lot of the work that they were doing was being done by volunteers, which is incredible, which is great. But they needed more. They needed more opportunity to do more work to provide better opportunities, better economic development, better housing for their communities. So the Neighborhood Preservation Program was created to provide administrative funds to not-for-profits, and the not-for-profits that dealt with housing, the neighborhood preservation companies. So the New York State Homes and Community Renewal provides funding for these not-for-profits to assist in housing. It is administrative, a body. It's a person that then works on grants, works on regulatory issues, works on, talking to people face to face. These neighborhood preservation companies are on the front line. So then these companies formed a coalition, and that was formed in 1989. And that is a group headed by me that works with all of our neighborhood preservation companies. We have around 135-ish, 136-ish. It fluctuates a little bit, especially in this time, just with the struggles that not-for-profits are having. So that's the number of folks we have in our coalition. And what do? What does the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition do on behalf of the neighborhood preservation companies? We provide technical assistance. We help these neighborhood preservation companies with grant applications, research, because a lot of these not-for-profits are mom and pop shops. They may have 2, 3, 4 staff. And for these grant applications that we assist them going after, they need specific GIS, Geographic Information Services. They need census data. They need community service data that comes out to apply for these grants. So we assist them with that. We also, provide lobbying on their behalf. We also provide training, lobbying. Those are kind of our main planks that we do at the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition. I'll get into more in a little bit, but I think that's a good 50,000-foot overview and not too long.
Right. So thanks, Mark. And so let's drop from 50,000 down to 40,000, right? So the term housing can be all encompassing, from anything from construction to support services and anything in between. And when we think about preservation, that could be potentially, could lead somebody to believe, whether right or wrong, a certain something about what it is that you do. But I think, part of having you move into this position, and I've known you in years past and a variety of others, is you provide a lot of direct services through your coalition as well. So let's dive into that a little bit, because I think that, if I was to hear the term housing support or preservation coalition, I would think maybe, well, that's not really relevant to me, but that's not the case at all, is it?
No, because it's a good point, because the services, it's housing. Our goal is to provide safe, clean, affordable housing in the neighborhoods that are more challenged, struggling than others. And we represent, locations across the entire state. The Neighborhood Preservation Program, we look at communities 25,000 and higher. We have a sister agency, the Rural Preservation Coalition, that's more hence rural areas. But we look at, we're located mainly in cities, large suburban centers, where there are communities that need help, that need revitalization. Because I see the neighborhood preservation companies as two main things that we do. We do many things, but I kind of break it down into two buckets. One is housing. We make sure that if you need a place to live, we will help you find that place to live. You need services, we will help you find those services. And once you get into a home or into a unit, we then will provide you with other training, workforce development, healthy eating habits, all these type of things. So that's one thing. And the other thing is our companies invest in their communities. They build new structures. They rehabilitate buildings. So, you look at that vacant storefront or that eyesore that's located somewhere. Lots of times our companies will take those over, rehabilitate them, and provide housing for folks in need. So, that's kind of our two major buckets that I see the services we provide. But our not-for-profit companies also provide aftercare programs for kids, senior meals, nutrition, workforce development, the whole gamut that not-for-profits provide, our companies do. So the housing portion may be a large portion of it, and of course, to me, the most important portion of it, but all the services they provide are integral to communities getting stronger.
That's great. And I love that deeper of a dive. That's what I was hoping that you would get at, which is, again, in my opening, when I talked about how important it is to connect the dots. That was always important prior to COVID. And, Mark, I've known you long enough. There's more than enough work out there. There is no turf issues. We have to figure out ways to continue to do what we're doing today, which is really utilize these incredible assets and human beings and leaders that we have out there to really make those connections. So our folks knowing who you guys are, for your companies to know who we are, because the things that we deal with are life situations, not a particular state agency or anything like that. So I think that that's really important. Now, Charlie, from your perspective and understanding, of course, you came from this environment, so you're very well aware of Mark and his coalition, and what we're trying to do as an agency, which is connect those dots and make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. What Mark really talked about was that access issue, whether it be building housing, renovating housing, helping people find housing, which, I think is really going to become a major challenge in the months ahead, depending on what happens economically and with some of these, eviction orders. But can you describe some of the challenges from where you sat and where you sit that older adults are facing in terms of housing access? And, you could tie in certainly the environment we're in under the COVID-19 pandemic and how that's maybe impacted some of those access issues.
Sure. So older adults, particularly those relying on limited incomes, have historically faced challenges related to housing affordability, habitability, so safe and clean environments, and also just finding housing that enables access to services in the community. The pandemic has certainly amplified these issues, and challenges like unemployment and illness pose threats to economic security and place folks with limited incomes at risk of things like falling behind on rent and potentially being displaced. And people facing these economic hardships who find themselves at risk of eviction or homelessness are also among those experiencing some of the most severe consequences of COVID-19, which we're seeing. And some of those consequences include higher infection rates and serious health complications. And this makes stable housing an urgent priority, especially for older adults, and particularly for those who are dually vulnerable to housing cost burden and unfavorable health outcomes. So that's just my read of the landscape right now.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right about that. And I'll ask you both this question because I'm interested in both of your perspectives. New York does a lot of great things. We lead the nation in so many innovative areas that really enhance consumer protections, that work to, support families regardless of people's ages. But what, in both of your opinion, we'll start with you, Charlie, what are some of the enhanced housing protections introduced both at the state level and, I think the federal protections are as important as well to protect those who are financially impacted by COVID-19?
Sure, that's a really important question because there's been a lot of talk about the Eviction Moratorium and folks want to know, what is this? How does it impact me? And am I eligible? So one thing I'll say is that here in New York State, Governor Cuomo actually introduced one of the nation's most progressive responses to the pandemic by signing the Tenant Safe Harbor Act. This act prohibits the eviction of tenants who demonstrate financial hardship caused by the pandemic during the period of COVID-19. And for New York State, the period of COVID-19 began on March 7th in 2020 and is currently in effect until January 1st, 2021, or until the governor indicates otherwise. At the same time, on the federal level, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued an order temporarily halting residential evictions for non-payment of rent for those most impacted by COVID-19. This order is on a similar timeline as our state protections and is currently in effect until December 31st, 2020. An important point to note is that those eligible for these enhanced protections, though, will still eventually owe rent to their landlords. These protections are really meant to just halt evictions only temporarily. And so people should still prepare to fulfill their obligations in terms of paying rent and also, abiding by any other obligations of their lease.
Okay. Mark, anything to add on that?
A couple things that come to my mind a little bit based on your question and Charlene's response was that the state and HCR came out with the COVID rent relief program in August or July. I think the deadline was August. And that was fantastic. I mean, it's sad that we need it, but it is what is needed because the challenge is rent's still due. And, and from our coalition, we see both ends of it because, our goal in our not-for-profits and our neighborhood preservation companies is to make sure we have safe, affordable housing. But we also partner with developers, landlords, and we work with them. The problem is the landlord, the homeowner may have a mortgage, and that's the struggle that must be addressed. And that's why, the governor's doing a very good job of highlighting that these things are going to come due. Senator Kavanaugh, the housing chair for the Senate, and Assemblyman Steve Simberwitz, the housing chair for the New York State Assembly, last year when they passed the historic Tenant Protection Act of 2019, that was a great start. And I don't want to say it was foreboding, maybe foreshadowing, but those things are needed now more than ever because you're going to evict them. Where do they go? It's the classic, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. Let's have the plan. Let's make sure we're set on what we're going to do to make sure that people stay in their homes. Communities do not take a turn for the worse. So that's why, we're fighting for the federal stimulus package. We work with a national group called the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this is one of the things that, why we partner with them is because they're our voice in DC from our coalition standpoint. And that is just one thing that we have to have and that we need. So I think those are a couple of things that came to my mind based on the excellent points that Charlene made in your question, Greg.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And you guys both mentioned financial hardship in this. And so, can you give a little bit more information on how you are to prove financial hardship? What does that actually mean? And given the lay of the land, right, there's a push and pull on both sides. You've got individuals who, because of the economic environment we're in, may not be able to afford their rent and therefore aren't paying their rent. And as you mentioned, Mark, on the flip side, you've got landlords who have a mortgage and they rely on that rent in order to, continue to pay that mortgage. So if somebody feels like they meet the criteria of financial hardship, which you'll tell us what that is, but can still be caught in this difficult situation of maybe not knowing that they fit the category, may be pressured, and I'm certainly not saying that landlords en masse are looking to unload people, but the reality is there's financial hardships on both sides, from the landlord side as well as the individual side. What should somebody do if they find themselves, first of all, thinking that they meet that financial hardship, and second of all, if they feel like they're being targeted or pressured, frankly, to move out or an eviction process?
Sure. I can speak to that, Mark, if that's okay. One of the things that folks will probably want to do is make sure that they have something to substantiate their hardship. The CDC website has a sample declaration form, but they'll also want to be able to substantiate that declaration with maybe proof of income prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, and then perhaps any change in eligibility for things like cash assistance, supplemental nutrition assistance, or the home energy assistance programs, or other benefits as well.
So Charlie, is it a moving number based on a person's specific situation, or is it like, you know, if you make X amount of dollars, you know, you'd be considered or have lost your job or something to that effect? So I guess what I mean by that is maybe I have a higher income, but I have a variety of different expenses or out-of-pocket health care. Is it a moving target that's very individualized, or is there kind of parameters to it?
My understanding is that in courts, it's really a judge's determination. And so a judge, if someone finds themselves in housing court, they would have to substantiate proof of their hardship, and a judge would make that determination. Have they experienced loss of income because of the pandemic? Are their circumstances changing? Are they experiencing a loss of income and unable to support basic expenses? And so that would probably be based on circumstances. Yeah, and it would really, sometimes it depends on the judge's determination of the situation in housing court, and would that fall under a COVID-19 related hardship?
Okay. So you just mentioned court. So I'm going to ask the two of you guys, because process is everything, is it not? How do you wind up in court? So I guess my question is, if I am the subject of an eviction notice, or I'm being told I'm going to be evicted, or I get something in writing to that effect, are you suggesting I therefore have the right to be heard in court? And how does that work?
Yes. So I think that's a really important question. And it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now with the economic challenges many households are navigating amid the pandemic. The most important thing to remember about evictions is that a landlord must go through a court process in order for an eviction to be considered legal. And there are specific steps that need to take place to set this process in motion. So a landlord cannot bring a tenant to court for non-payment unless they have first issued a 14-day written rent demand. And in a case of non-payment, a tenant can only be evicted for non-payment of rent. And things like late fees, legal fees, or maintenance fees cannot be considered a cause for eviction. Another thing to remember is for folks who do find themselves in housing court, often judges really encourage tenants and landlords to sort out some kind of payment arrangement. So maybe you're behind a few months on your rent and you can't really afford to pay a lump sum, but you could pay it in installments in addition to regularly scheduled rent payments. So often judges will encourage that if it's feasible. And if it's not feasible, or if there is an agreement made and a tenant doesn't uphold that payment agreement, then an eviction warrant can be issued. The last thing to note, which is really critical about evictions, is that an eviction can only be executed by a sheriff or a marshal. And right up until a tenant is legally evicted by a sheriff or a marshal, the non-payment case can be dismissed if a tenant finds a way to pay all the owed rent. But anything outside of that, any attempt to remove a tenant from a property outside of a legal eviction process in court would be considered an unlawful eviction. So things like threats or use of force by a landlord, removing possessions from the unit, removing the doors, changing locks, or otherwise preventing access to the unit without going through a legal court process is actually an unlawful eviction. So to answer your question, long-winded response, but yes, in order to be evicted, that has to take place in court.
Yeah, no, and this is so important that I appreciate the long-winded response. And I knew some of this because I sat in on your training to our network on exactly these issues. And so I know that Kelly is going to post the training slide deck that you had provided, because I think these nuances in terms of what you can expect in writing, what some of these procedural things are critically important, so people know that, you know, if you're not following the process, what's happening to you is not legal and that you have some recourse. Mark, let's move over to you. We live in a metric, not the metric system, but in a system that looks at data and metrics and outcomes. And I really like that because it really helps us to evaluate our effectiveness, regardless of whether we're a public or private entity. For the preservation companies and the coalition, how do you guys define success, and what are measurable accomplishments in your mind? Are they associated with a particular plan? or how do you go about measuring the success of your network?
Thank you. That's a great question, because we need to do that. Because how do you define success and failure? You need benchmarks. But actually, just before I go to that question, Greg, if you don't mind, if I just want to go back to a previous question. That
Of course.
when individuals are finding hardships in their housing, you can go to the MPC website, you can go to the HCR website, and there'll be a list of not-for-profits, housing preservation companies within your geographic area. Utilize them. Ask them the questions. Call them. Go to their websites, because those are services we provide. We provide, housing counseling, tenant, home buyer, foreclosure prevention. We assist with mediation between landlords and tenants, because many times it's an intimidating process. You're struggling. It's in the world of COVID, and you have to talk to, in some cases, this big landlord type situation. It's frightening. It's scary. It's just tough times for everybody. We're there to help and support. Our companies, that's what they do. These are not neighborhood preservation companies. They are on the front line. They're, in the office, the storefront down the street from the housing unit. Unfortunately, we can't do the face-to-face because one of the things that we also provide was just a shoulder, an ear to listen, somebody that you could, work through your problems with. So utilize the resource of these not-for-profits. They are experts, and they will know, if they don't have the answer, they'll know where to go look. The state has this fantastic resource guide that I think we spoke about at one point, Greg, maybe during one of the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition webinars, that we can help identify these issues. So that was I just wanted to, add on to that. Thank you for allowing me to do that. But
no, and before you answer, because I'm glad you said that, and I was going to ask you how would people contact your network? I think Kelly probably, while you were speaking, put your website into the chat box so that people have that resource. But I really appreciate you talked about the specialty and your willingness, because this is what the jobs are of these folks, to receive these calls to help people really navigate what can be an unbelievably difficult and stressful time at a time where we're already overwhelmed with what's happening with COVID. And I think that's the point about this. But I think, to summarize, you guys are community. You're not some outside, external, large entity that doesn't have a grasp on, what the community looks like, what the community resources are, and how to even, connect those types of dots. So I think that that's a major point that you made, that you're out there and willing to receive these inquiries and to assist folks. You mentioned earlier you had over 130 something, companies throughout the state, which covers the entire state. So it really doesn't matter where you live in New York. You have somebody out there who specializes in this type of pretty intricate and overwhelming, right? I mean, if we don't go through these types of things ourselves, how would you know? That's the whole purpose of this. So I appreciate you saying that, and we'll reiterate and get that information out. But let's go back to the original question around measurable accomplishments, defining success, because I think your companies really are the definition of community.
It's yes. And I put some numbers into perspective just because I think numbers always help. At least they help me. I'm a data guy. So we receive about $12.8 million, the Neighborhood Preservation Program, from New York State. And that gets equally divided between all the neighborhood preservation companies. But what do we get for that money? What does the taxpayer get for that investment? We can measure it in many different variables. One, we could just talk about the money that's leveraged off of that. 12.8 million, we receive roughly a 25 to $1 return. So, 25, times 12.8, it's about $300 million that gets reinvested in our neighborhoods. That fixes up the building, that provides the housing, that, allows kids to go after school, that allows, a nutrition center, that, those things are just endless, And one of the things that the neighborhood preservation companies do, and one of the things I forgot to mention earlier that is probably appropriate for this audience is the accessibility modifications. As we get older, it's tougher to go up and down steps. It's just these type of things that we need support for. The railing in the house, the walkway into the front door. We provide that type of assistance. We help with that funding. These companies, they do that. They partner with other groups to make sure that they can have that. Because in many instances, it's less expensive to keep people in their home than have them go somewhere else, because many people want to stay in their home. Some people don't, but many people do. So what's the option? What's the best way to do it? So lots of times these accessibility modifications provides that safety net, or provides that relief, or that crutch, no pun intended, to help them make that decision. So, it's 25 to 1, leveraged. And, we have, I'm just looking at some of the data that HCR actually, we have to provide all our data to Homes and Community Renewal. And the folks there are great. They do a fantastic job. They work with us, and they understand the challenges that we have. So what do we offer? We offer tentative assistance counseling associations. We have about 35,000 instances where we've engaged in that this year. We've helped attain mortgages and loans of $65 million. Special populations assisted by preservation services, over 20,000. So, these are things that we do, that we have youth programs, weed and seed programs, block associations, grant writing, infrastructure, community planning projects, because, it's lots of times it's just more than brick and mortar. What's the green space? What are the things that make a community thrive, that make it home? So those are some of the things that we focus on. And like I said, over 4,000 units we improved and rehabilitated. 400 residential new construction. Just the numbers go on and on, but without going into them ad nauseum. I think that's a good big picture of the success, of the return on the investment. If every program in New York State got a return on investment, that would be incredible. We return. The investment helps the community grow. It helps the local governments. It puts housing and homes back on the tax roll. So, and it just makes it a neighborhood. It makes it a community. It makes it a home.
Yeah, no, and again, I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, there's so much overlap between what it is that we do and what it is you do, and then you have these specialty services that we don't have, and we have some specialty services as well. But I like the return on investment idea and what you're talking about there, and to be able to articulate that. You're absolutely right in terms of small home modifications. These are low budget, high yield impact types of services that you talk about. And as we're sitting here, because when I first met you, back in the mid 2000s, you were working at the Department of State, and what were we kicking off? The age-friendly work that New York is now the first age-friendly state. And what you really describe is a major facet, not only on the access to housing piece, but what makes up a community, the intergenerational nature. You have senior services that you provide, after-school care, working with green space, transportation options, downtown revitalization. All of that is part of smart growth, livable communities, age-friendly. So I appreciate that. I'm going to start with you, Charlie, but Mark, if you want to comment on this as well, because really what we're talking about in a lot of different things is not only the protections, but access to housing, We're always looking to, upgrade the stock. We have one of the oldest housing stocks in the nation in New York, just because of how old New York and this region is in New England. But if somebody is looking for housing currently, what advice would you give them? Where would they go? Is your network, Mark, a place that they should tap? And Charlene, from your experience, where's the first place that somebody should go if they're either not happy with their housing or looking for a change, or certainly trying to access new housing?
Sure. So a couple of things on finding new housing. I think, first of all, for people who might have limited incomes and maybe need some financial assistance finding new housing, good places to start are local departments of social services, and they can determine eligibility for any financial assistance, whether it's housing related or if there are just other benefits like cash assistance or supplemental nutrition assistance that can, help free up cash to support housing costs. Another thing, which kind of Mark already touched on, is just understanding the landscape in your area. And every locality is different in terms of the kinds of resources available through community-based organizations. But the organization I used to work at in Albany, we were a member organization of the NPC, which Mark currently oversees. And every week we would put out a list of affordable apartment listings. And I think there are similar operations across the state that do things like that for communities, for people to access affordable housing and affordable apartment listings. And I say understand the landscape in your community, because really community organizations, community-based organizations can be such a great resource in providing things like housing counseling, emergency financial assistance, sometimes initial help with move-in costs when you're getting into a new place, and also just linkages to other services that can really improve circumstances for households who might be struggling and just need a little boost.
Absolutely.
And Mark, go ahead.
Charlene will hit the nail on the head. It's utilize the not-for-profits. You understand your geography. Like I said, it's easier said than done. You move into a new community, you're not sure where to go. So it's one of those things that many instances local governments can assist with that, because I believe there's an office for aging in every county in the state, and hopefully a lot of them have relationships with the not-for-profits in that community so that they work together. It's one of those things that, I may not have the exact answer, but you need to call Michelle at this number and she'll help you out. Or you need to call Joe over here and he can help you with that. So it's those type of things that were a reference, were a resource, and when in doubt, ask. It's ask the question.
Yeah, thank you. So we talked a little bit about, some of the federal and state protections. We talked a little bit about what people should do if they find themselves in a situation. Let's talk about being proactive, right? One of the things that we try to do at the Office for Aging is to prevent something from happening in the future, a decline in functioning, hospital, deterring people from the hospital by providing service. I think you would do the same within your network, Mark. But so let's take a group of people that might not be in a crisis yet, but maybe worried about, future eviction because of their economic circumstance. I'll start with you, Mark, on a proactive way for an individual or a family who may be concerned about the future, and specifically a future eviction. What would you tell them to do?
Communicate. Talk. Reach out to their landlord. Reach out to their tenant organizer that they may have in their community. It's be proactive. Reach out. Talk to folks, because the landlord, in many, many instances, they don't want to go down this road. Of course, we always have the few bad apples. You can see that any day in the press. You have that in any organization. That, the landlord's trying to get you out so they could ask for more money or make it a different type of housing. You know, that's more the exception than the rule. But situations where, you know, landlords in many cases will work with you. You know, I know an instance where, you know, there's an individual that lives in New York City and their lease is up, and their landlord's saying, you know, geez, your next lease is for this much, which is like $700 cheaper than what they're paying now. So it just kind of tells you what the market is a little bit. You know, that's New York City based, which of course is different than, you know, Syracuse, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany. You know, everybody has its own little nuance. But communicate, do a little homework, you know, and it can be overwhelming, but, you know, the resources are there. You can talk to the folks at the not-for-profits. You know, you can talk for the folks at the county, you know, at the county government level and your municipalities, because these people want to help. You know, we are in this business because none of us are becoming billionaires and millionaires in this business. We do this because we want to help people. So, you know, we encourage people to ask questions. And that's why we try to advertise all the different things we do in as many different ways as we can. Because the challenge is they don't know who to ask. It's just, you know, so what do we do to help make that easier for them? So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to underscore what you said, Mark, is a really important point. I think because of the relationships you also have with landlords, providing that perspective that, you know, you can have a conversation with your landlord. They do want to work with you. They do want to help. Don't wait till the last minute. There are things you can do up front that you may be surprised at the reaction from, right? I think that's kind of the point, and that you have not only the, you know, the pulse on the tenants, but also understanding the perspective of the landlords, I think can help make some better outcomes. So, Charlie, what types of resources are available for people who might need financial assistance or other types of assistance, you know, to prevent an eviction or find new housing?
Sure. So kind of, as I noted earlier, you know, if you're concerned about cash flow and you maybe want to prevent an eviction, or you might find it more appropriate to secure different housing, most of the time you'll want to start at your local Department of Social Services. There you can apply for emergency financial assistance. Often you can apply for assistance to move into a new place, and you can determine eligibility for other benefits. There are other resources with the local public housing authorities, the housing choice vouchers, but admittedly those lists to get on a waiting list for a housing choice voucher, they're often quite lengthy, and the lists only open up every couple of years, but it's something to keep your eye on. If you think you might be eligible and perhaps you're looking down the road and subsidized housing might make sense for you, it makes sense to keep your eye on that and go to a local public housing authority if there is an opening and apply to get on the list. And just kind of what I noted earlier about, you know, accessing the local community-based organizations and faith-based organizations too, in some cases, those organizations really have an interest in keeping you sheltered. And as Mark noted, you know, just if you're in a pinch with your current landlord, communicate, because it's in everybody's best interest. It's in the best interest of the landlord, it's in the best interest of the community, and it's in your best interest to do what you can to try to stay sheltered.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And, you know, you mentioned, you know, organizations like DSS, you mentioned, again, Mark's Network, other not-for-profits. Of course, for those of you who are viewing this or will view this in the future, obviously the Offices for the Aging are places to go to. I think the benefits that people are entitled to that they do not get are overwhelming. So I'll give you a couple of examples to build upon, you know, what Charlene had talked about. You know, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, if you're income eligible, provides the average older adult about $200 a month. I mean, think about that. That's $2,400 a year in assistance to purchase food. We have programs that help for prescription drugs. You can apply for the low-income subsidy or the Medicare Savings Program. There's a lot of those, the HEAP benefit. There's a lot of those types of benefits that people are eligible for that they're not taking advantage of. Now, how does that relate to housing? Well, it absolutely relates to housing, because if you're putting cash back in your pocket or not spending as much in certain things, then that means you can free up some of your discretionary income to maybe make those housing costs more affordable. So I think that, you know, for those of you out there, that's nothing to be embarrassed about. You know, that's what these things are for. That's why our taxpayer dollars go to providing these benefits. You know, when you go to college kids, and I was one of them, had no issue applying for a Pell Grant or a TAP grant. Well, what's the difference between that assistance and nutrition assistance? There really is none. For some reason, as a culture, we vilified some of those things and others seem to be acceptable. But I urge you to tap these different resources and see what you might be eligible for. It might put hundreds of dollars a month into your pocket. Mark, what do you see as the biggest need as we go forward?
The biggest need, excellent question. I just want to give you one piece of data based on something you just said first. You know, 55% of renters are housing cost burdened. And the definition of a housing cost burden is that over 30% of your income goes for housing, you know, and almost 40% of homeowners are, you know, housing cost burdened. So it's not the exception anymore. That number, unfortunately, has been going up every year. The percent of those people being housing cost burdened increases. So ways to find support, other resources like you just mentioned, you know, helps alleviate that unfortunate trend that we're fighting right now of how much of your income goes to housing. So that's just, you know, that was a very good point that you made. I just wanted to add on to that. So what is our biggest need? It has to be rent relief. We need a stimulus program, a federal stimulus bill that provides resources to the tenants and the landlords, because, you know, you just can't have the tenants not going to pay, you know, because then the landlord, you know, so we need a program that provides resources to the tenant and the landlord. We have to have that, or this is just going to it's going to become a disaster. And that is one of the things that we are fighting for, you know, at the federal government, as is New York State, as, you know, Homes and Community Renewal, as all the organizations that we work with. We have to have that stimulus package, just because it's dollars and cents. It's money, money, money. It's the unfortunate challenge that we all face, but we need these type of programs that, you know, because once the eviction date ends and I owe 6 months in rent, nobody saves 6 months in rent. You know,
right.
You're the worker that works at a restaurant. You're the bartender. You're the service industry person that, you know, you were getting by fine beforehand, but now you lost a third, a half of your income. And it's not like you're saving money that you're just going to pay the rent at the end. There's nothing in the piggy bank to pay. So it's those situations that we have to have that type of resources available to get everybody back on footing, that then they could go forward. So I think that's the biggest need that we have, are the resources for the tenants, resources for the landlords, so we can pick up as much as possible where we left off pre-COVID.
So I think that that's a really good point. And I know that you are not the only organization, both within New York and across the country, that has identified and is advocating for that need. So let's take this opportunity while we have, you know, folks that are either viewing this live or will be in the future. What can they do to assist you in making the point in the federal stimulus package to have that included amongst some of the other items that I know that we're pushing as well, like nutrition funding? What would be helpful to you for folks that are listening out there? Can they be engaged to assist you and the nation of folks like you to try to make sure that those real basic needs, which is safe, affordable housing, winds up in the next stimulus package?
I think it's important that you communicate with your elected leaders. You know, New York is a little bit different because our elected leaders are fighting for this already. So, you know, making a phone call to, you know, your local congressman, of course, that may depend on which party they are in, to help, you know, deliver your message, because, you know, it's not to bring politics into the conversation, but, you know, New York is fighting for these things now. Our, you know, majority of our House congressional representatives are fighting for this. There's pushback, you know, all politics is local, you know, there's getting pushbacks from, you know, the present administration. You know, what's the new administration going to do? So it's as much as that fighting for these resources, but specifying what the resources are. So, you know, so I always say reach out to your elected officials, let them know, because they need to be reminded. You know, it's advocacy 101. You have to communicate your message. You have to deliver your message as many different mediums as possible. You know, we do phone calls, we do visits, we do letter writing campaigns. You know, all those type of things is to communicate what you need and what you want. You know, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, you know, but you got to stand up and speak up if you want to be recognized.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And just like COVID, housing is not a red or a blue issue. So regardless of the party that, or, you know, your geographic area, Mark's point's exactly right. It really doesn't matter, because these issues are non-political. These are real basic survival, basic need issues that people are facing, and political party really doesn't matter. Charlene, from your lens, not in your previous job, but this job that you're in here, knowing that we are putting extra emphasis on rebuilding our housing capacity, reconnecting with folks like Mark and others, what do you see as the greatest need and biggest challenge moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark really hit the nail on the head when he said rent relief. I think that's so important for people who are struggling to meet basic needs, who are struggling to afford housing. And as he noted earlier, so many people are housing cost burdened. And actually in New York State, over 900,000 people are considered extremely housing cost burden, or extremely low income. And of those, a third of those households include an older adult resident. So this is really important to all of New York State, but it's especially important to older adults. So I would definitely say rent relief is really critically important. Another thing I think is important is through the lens of the New York State Office for the Aging, and also just from what I'm seeing in my community, is deteriorating housing stock. And that's especially challenging for perhaps older adults who've been living in properties for a really long time, and they don't want to move, but they're having a hard time getting up the stairs, or they have to run to the store to get medication and it's hard to get in and out of their house. Difficulty with things like peeling paint or poor ventilation inside of their house. So I think things like funding to address those issues is critically important. So making sure housing stock, especially for older adults, especially for people who are vulnerable, is safe and habitable, is really important as well.
Yeah, and I think those are great points. And you talk about like energy efficiency and the suck on resources that is. And I think, you know, you can't do this in this type of program that we're providing. But, you know, I think, again, Mark worked in state government as well. You know what this administration is all about. And it's connecting all of these agencies that, you know, you might have NYSOFA doing weatherization and home assessment. Like there's all of these pieces that make up this whole, whether it be benefits and application assistance, whether it be, you know, trying to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases. All of this stuff centers around housing and community. So I think it's really important to just make those connections. So Mark, one final question for each of you, but I'll start with you, Mark. Is there anything that we didn't cover if you had the open floor, that you would want people to know?
Good question. I think that, and I'll reiterate something versus something new. Reach out, communicate, ask the question, because chances are we will be able to find ways to help. You know, there's no magic wand. It's you know, we can't solve every problem, but we're going to try, because that's what we do, and that's what we want to do. Because people that work in neighborhood preservation companies, work at the coalitions, work for these not-for-profits, you know, their heart is in their neighborhood, their heart is in their community. So reach out to us, utilize us, don't hesitate to ask. So if I had a parting word, that's what mine would be.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's great. And again, in our chat, we have listed your website and your members. We'll make sure that we get that out as well. Charlene, how about you?
Sure. I would say I would echo what Mark said, and then also just, you know, as we get into the colder months, and it's certainly not a topic we'd like to think about someone potentially losing shelter, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, that we are approaching cold blue season, and each locality has a plan in place to account for people who are without shelter or unexpectedly lose shelter. And local social service agencies coordinate with police departments and community-based and faith-based organizations. And if you find yourself without shelter and the temperatures are reaching 32 degrees or below, just know that each locality is required to shelter you, and there's a plan in place in every county. And so worst case scenario, if you find yourself without housing, like what Mark said, reach out to your community and there will be shelter for you in the cold months. It's something to keep in mind. That's really.
I appreciate you raising that. That's really important. So for those of you who are listening, if any of you are from Mark's network, the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition, there are going to be people who are 60 and older that might have some needs that are outside of your specialty. Please feel free to refer those folks to your county office for the aging. For all of the county office for agings out there and our subcontractors, we have about 1,200 not-for-profits we work with. We are not housing experts. If you run across people in your day-to-day work that may have some housing issues, may be facing an eviction, may be concerned about homelessness, you have now a connection to Mark's network. This is what they do. This is what they specialize in. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We each have specialties. There's a little bit of overlap. The goal of this is to make those connections, not to remember every little bit of information that came out today, but know who that first call is that can help those connections get going. So I want to, I really appreciate the two of you taking the time today. I think housing is really important. This is going to be a topic I think we'll revisit again in a couple of months and have the both of you on. But before I wrap up, I want to shift gears a little bit. We are 2 days away from Thanksgiving. We are almost 9 months into this pandemic, and where are we in the lay of the land? We are having almost 2,000 deaths a day across the country. We have the highest number of infections since the virus began. The spikes in some states have over 50% rate of infection. New York and New Yorkers under the governor's leadership have done an amazing job in following protocols that we have known have been in place for months and months and months. Wear your mask, good hand hygiene, social distancing, but now we're moving into the most social time of the year. We have Thanksgiving in 2 days. We have college kids coming home. We have Christmas. We have New Year's, and we're just beginning the flu season. So the darkest days, unfortunately, are going to be ahead. And I know that people are tired. I know that there's COVID fatigue. I know we all want to get back to a sense of normalcy, but there won't be a sense of normalcy if we don't continue to hunker down like we have been. As the governor mentioned yesterday, it's going to be about 5 or 6 months till we get to critical mass on vaccination distribution in New York. So I'm just urging you all to hang in there for another couple of months, do the things that you need to do to protect yourself and to protect your family so that we can continue to stay 3% or less and really lead the nation in our response when we were at one point the most infected state in the country, and now we're one of the best. But it remains important for all of us to stay vigilant. So I want to thank my good friend Mark Streb, who's the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition in New York State. Utilize their members, utilize their expertise. That's what they're here for. I want to thank Charlene Bradt, who works for us, Charlene. I'm still getting used to learning that she goes by Charlie, and for her expertise and dedication, not only to our agency, but to this particular topic in particular, based on her past. Our next two Facebook Lives next week, we have phase 2 of our caregiving series, where we have Ask the Experts. So anybody who finds themselves caring for a loved one, regardless of age or ability, this will be an opportunity for you to ask our experts directly some questions that we can provide any types of information on, and any community supports that'll help you in that role. And then the following one, we are going to be introducing what's called the age-friendly health systems, which is part of our state's effort to create, the best communities to grow up and grow old and regardless of age. So we look forward to that. So again, I want to thank Mark and Charlie. I want to thank everybody here for participating. Please stay safe through the holidays and beyond, and keep continuing to do what you do to keep yourselves and your families safe. So thanks, everybody, and have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you. Have a safe and hopefully relaxing holiday.